It all started one fine morning in the kingdom of Stein, in the castle of Trestlot. The boy who had chestnut-colored hair turned to the saint and placed the tiara on her head. He looked her straight in the eyes and asked if she was ready to do this. The girl, without hesitation, immediately said that of course she was ready. She replied that she was ready to do it, even though people hated her. She knew that she needed it and was not going to back down from her goal. At that moment, the man immediately smiled happily, extended his hand forward to her, and said that he understood everything, and for this reason suggested that they should hurry. The girl hesitated for a moment, but put her hand in his, and they went straight to the large number of people who were standing outside the doors. As soon as they came out, the girl immediately heard a dead silence. None of the people made a single sound. Everyone just looked at this couple and were unhappy. When the saint was about to say something, suddenly one of the people threw a stone in her direction, but it did not hit the girl, but flew past. But immediately after this action, loud screams were heard from the people who called her a murderer. They were all very unhappy and were ready to tear the girl to shreds. They accused her of the fact that their entire family died precisely because of the girl, and also that they were paying a huge tribute to the empire. They said that the girl was not a saint at all. She was a real fake, so she did not deserve to have this title, and they wanted there to be justice. Of course, the saint immediately panicked and felt very uncomfortable about all of this. She thought that she could endure it, but she was wrong. But the man who came out with her immediately turned to her. He hugged the girl, trying to somehow cheer her up. However, she only whispered that everything people said was true. The girl was the Holy Empire of Lavria, and this empire ruled absolutely all continents. All the surrounding nations swore their allegiance to him, and the reason the empire could maintain control was obvious. He had the sole power to cleanse the shadow demons born from the shadow plague, and such a person in that territory was precisely the saint. It was this girl who could perform miracles that people incredibly needed. In fact, it all started long before that coronation. The girl was still very young, and when she approached the empire, she was amazed, and all because, through the window, she saw huge purple clouds that were approaching the city. Of course, she was then very scared and realized that this was the most terrible shadow disaster she had ever seen in her life, and knew that now people's lives were in danger. Then she turned to the coachman and shouted loudly, telling him to hurry to Stein's kingdom. They needed to get there as soon as possible. Of course, the man was a little surprised when he heard this, but he immediately quickened his pace because he understood that it was important. Meanwhile, this storm had already captured absolutely the entire kingdom. Various demons even began to appear there, attacking people. Men and women, children and adults ran from these terrible demons because they feared that if they stopped even for a short time, death would come to them. Soon, you were not even noticed by their demons at the gates of the castle where most of the people were hiding. And besides, if these gates fell, then absolutely everyone would come to an end. This would mean defeat. For this reason, the knights who stood on the other side of the wall immediately began to confront these demons. They had to protect the entrance at any cost. However, one of the main ones in the army shouted to everyone else not to panic. Saint was supposed to arrive from the empire at any moment. For this reason, the knights had to simply hold out for a while until she arrived, and after that, they would definitely be rescued. Of course, the guys were immediately happy about this, and even breathed a sigh of relief. But then one of the knights saw how a huge shadow demon began to approach the commander. The guy was incredibly scared. He already wanted to scream, but he didn't have time because the demon bit off the man's head faster than he could even open his mouth. Meanwhile, a little boy, who was the son of this very commander, stood at the top and watched everything that was happening in the castle. There were a lot of muttons lying on the floor after these battles. The knights walked from side to side. They had to strengthen the front gate, but the boy was not afraid. He was very brave and had to remain calm. The knights were in despair. Some lost consciousness. Others were very strong and were wounded. But it was impossible to even provide them with emergency assistance because there were simply not enough doctors. And the boy who watched all this was incredibly sad. Of course, he really wanted to find a way to protect them all. He did not want to see human grief and suffering, as well as death. But at that moment, his younger brother turned to him. He looked at him with tearful eyes and asked if it was true that when the shadow demons attacked, they made the whole body black, because he had heard about it. His hands were shaking. He took his brother by the shirt and asked if this really meant that he, too, had to become black. Of course, the boy did not understand how it all worked and heard all this only from rumors. But this fear was quite justified. But despite all this, his older brother smiled and said that everything should be fine with him, so he did not need to worry. Smiling, he also said that their father himself led all the knights, and this meant that everything should be fine, because their dad was the bravest knight in the whole world. He also told his younger brother that their father had probably already fought the shadow demons along with the saint. This meant that there was very little time left and everything should work out. Of course, he really hoped that his father should have protected them, but the boy didn't know what was happening at the front, so he just had to believe in the best. In fact, shadow demons were monsters that were born from sudden bursts of purple mist. They had no shadows and simply attacked living creatures. Using their instincts, any living creature they touched began to turn black, and this blackness spread throughout the body. And of course, in the worst case, all this even led to fatal outcomes, that is, to death. The fog usually cleared within 2 or 3 days, but the destruction it caused was enormous, which is why it was called the shadow disaster. Few people managed to survive after encountering these themes in the fog, so this situation was incredibly difficult for everyone. The guy who was the Duke's eldest son stood at the door where the negotiations were taking place. He was sure that his father and the saint had to save all the people who were surrounded in the city. However, a knight from the frontline territory suddenly ran up to them and said that it was terrible because the shadow of the demon had attacked His Majesty. And this was quite obvious what it was supposed to lead to. The boy, hearing about this, immediately became very scared. At that moment, the man was brought into the estate. His wife was already next to him, and the children ran to check what was happening. And as soon as the eldest son saw the lifeless body of his father, it was hard for him to believe that all this was true. He didn't even have words. The boy just stood there and looked at him, and tears were streaming down his cheeks. Then the Duchess, as soon as she saw that her dear husband was dead, cried out loudly, and grief spread throughout the castle. The eldest son could not stand all this. He immediately abandoned everyone and ran to the exit. As soon as his younger brother saw this, he immediately tried to stop him, but it was all useless. The boy was eager to be together, and for this reason, he did not even think that it could be dangerous, and that he could not cope. And when he ran out onto the balcony, he saw that their entire kingdom was filled with this very fog, and he understood that he no longer had time to hesitate. He quickly came down and ran towards him. Thus the boy was seriously determined. He was ready to fight and win. When he approached a couple of demons, he immediately shouted loudly, asking how they dared to do this to his father and his people, for what reason they attacked them, and thought they had the right to kill. But he did not dare to talk to the demons for long. As soon as they started running towards him, he quickly moved his hand, which held a sharp sword, and chopped off their heads. However, at one point he was attacked by a rather strong demon, who bit off the blade of the boy's sword, and for this reason, the weapon was already useless. The guy stood on one knee, breathing heavily, wondering if this was really his end. In fact, he was not afraid of death. He just wanted revenge. At that moment, he had already accepted his fate, closed his eyes, and asked his father for forgiveness for the fact that he could not do anything. However, when after some time nothing happened, he suddenly opened his eyes and saw that a little girl with blonde hair was standing in front of him. This girl waved her arms and thus drove away these very demons. These dogs screamed, writhing in pain. The girl was serious. She directed absolutely all her strength and energy to these animals in order to protect them. Soon these demons simply evaporated into thin air. They burned to ashes, and then the girl slowly turned to the guy who was sitting behind her. The Duke's son himself noticed that her hair was the color of an amaryllis, which was the national flower of Stein. Then he immediately turned to her and asked if she was a saint. The girl, meanwhile, smiling happily, said that she had come just in time and she liked it. After the demons were already behind, Nam came closer to him and directed her energy to the boy's body, saying that his skin began to darken. However, she was ready to cleanse him. Of course, the guy started to protest. He said that her condition was much worse than his, and therefore she had to take care of herself first. But the saint refused this. She smiled and said that people needed her more, and she was just glad that everything was okay with him now. Some time passed since then, and she was able to clear out all the shadow demons in the area they were in. The girl turned to the boy and told him to take those people whom she had managed to save and take them to a safe place. But the boy asked the saint to go with them, because she had to do it. Of course, the girl replied that she could not stop right at that moment. There were other places that needed cleansing, and only she could do it. But at that moment, something went wrong, and she suddenly felt a strong pain in her head, and the girl began to fall. But the guy managed to catch her in time. He immediately said that her body could not withstand all this, so she had to stop. But the girl replied that even despite this, she had to go. Then the guy noticed that the girl's arm was damaged because of these dark animals. Meanwhile, the sun began to come out. The sun's rays fell straight onto the wound. He said the light made the dark skin even more painful. For this reason, he took out a small handkerchief and bandaged the girl's hand, saying that he tried to do everything in his power to help her at least a little. As soon as the saint looked at this handkerchief, she was very surprised, because I immediately felt much better. The pain went away, and my eyes no longer went dark. The guy, meanwhile, knelt down in front of her, and turning to the saint, asked her to protect this nation, while he would try to protect all other people. At that moment, the girl Radha smiled again, and promised him that she would do everything in her power to protect everything that was needed. Before leaving, the girl also thanked him for being able to treat her, but at that moment, he suddenly thought about his father, who was now completely engulfed in shadows. He thought about the fact that she kept trying for them, and all they could do was rely on this little girl who was supposed to save the entire nation. He thought that if he wanted to be as useful as the saint, he had to do at least his part of the work first. So the guy turned to those people she saved and sent them straight to the estate, while the saint ran and cleansed everyone else. She provided help to those who needed it, and then protected poor families from these demons. And all this took a lot of energy and strength. And when the girl again ran to someone for help, which she could not do because her strength was already running out, she simply fell to the ground and could not even move. These demons began to approach her. She understood that this was all very bad, but she could not do anything. Her strength was leaving her. She had used up too much of her power, and therefore could not do anything more. She felt very hurt because she had promised to protect this country, but now she could not even lift a finger. The girl understood that she had to get up, but she couldn't. The monsters surrounded her from all sides. They were ready to tear her apart at any moment. Yes, anyway, the tragedy of the kingdom during the Shadow Disaster weeks, I was later to become known as Stein's nightmare, and the people's anger and grief completely turned against the saint. No one believed anymore that she could somehow help them and save them. People simply did not accept this girl, and believed that it was because of her that all their nightmares occurred. And from that moment after this nightmare finally ended, the girl found herself in the estate of the Duke of Kalkar. The man was incredibly angry with her. He started yelling at the girl, saying that she couldn't even cleanse the shadow demons, or herself. It was very pitiful. Meanwhile, the saint lay on the ground. Her whole body was shaking. She was still incredibly exhausted. She simply could not do anything. The man watching her said that if she had just died, then at least the family would not have been as disgraced as they were now, when she could not do anything and simply set them all up. The girl asked him for forgiveness in a trembling voice. This man was her father. She said that she was really very sorry. She didn't want everything to turn out this way. But the man replied that half of Stein was destroyed. Tons of people died, and all of this was precisely because of her. And the king also passed away, simply because she could not do what she was supposed to. He came closer to her and said that all this was because she was a useless saint. It was all just a waste of time and energy, and a disgrace to the whole family. Sarah immediately started screaming. She asked him to give her another chance and let her go back there. She could definitely help everyone. She could fix this situation. But her father looked at her with a very stern look and told her not to dare touch him with her dirty body. She was a disgrace to this family, and for this reason, he no longer wanted them to have anything in common with each other. He turned around and started walking. and also said that she had to wait until Sarasa cleared her out. She was still on a mission, so she couldn't come back for a few days. He looked at her with a very stern look and said that up until this moment, she had to endure all the pain she had experienced and thought about what she had done. Sarah couldn't believe that they really did this to her. Her father just walked out and closed the door. She was still crying very loudly because she was in pain. It was the brightest room in the house, which was still oriented to the east. The black aura stopped much more painfully and strongly in the sunlight, and the father specially locked her there. He knew very well what consequences this had. The girl tried to close her eyes, but in front of her were still those figures of monsters that could pounce on her at any moment. She, of course, really wanted someone to help her. The pain was simply unbearable. She couldn't even move from the rays of the sun because she was too exhausted. In fact, the Kalkor family was the only line that was capable of purifying the black aura. A saint was born in every generation. They were also known to produce powerful sens. These people held the second in line of power, after the imperial family, in the Empire of Lavria. And so, when 6 years had passed since that moment after that storm, Sarah was even seated aside at the dinner table because her father still could not forgive her for this mistake. Next to him, he sat his most beloved daughter. He said that he had just received a message that her cleansing had been successful again, so he was incredibly pleased with her. Smiling, the man even said that this is what he should have expected from his beloved daughter, Sarasa. The girl with blonde hair smiled happily. She answered the man that since she was the next head of the Kalkor family, it was her duty to complete this task perfectly, and that was precisely why she tried her best. After that, she looked at her sister and said that, unlike her, she knew what she had to do, and Sarah hadn't even debuted in society, so she should be ashamed of her behavior. The girl then asked them for forgiveness with a trembling voice, but her father, smiling happily, said that someone like her should always stay out of sight so that no one would know about her existence. However, at least her help still made her at least a little useful for this family. With Prince Arnold, the second prince, she was able to help them significantly. Her sister smiled happily and said that Milis could hardly compete with someone like him, so she even laughed. The father looked at his second daughter and said that very soon they should hear news of the engagement from the imperial family, and if Sarah wanted to be useful to their family, then she should at least have married into the imperial family so that she could at least a little atone for that guilt. Sarah didn't even look up. She only said in a quiet voice that she understood everything. At that moment, someone suddenly knocked on their door. The man immediately paid attention to it and allowed them to enter. Then the butler came into their room. He apologized for disturbing them, but said that a letter had arrived from the imperial family. The man Viste immediately said from his place that Sarasa should stay and finish her meal, and in the meantime, he had to leave. The girl immediately said that there was no problem with that and wished him a good day. After that, the man walked out the door, and the eldest daughter stood up from her seat and, looking at her sister, said that she was not at all interested in joining forces with her. She definitely did not want to establish a relationship. Sarah also immediately stood up from her seat, asked her for forgiveness, and said that she would leave immediately, and also asked that her sister continue eating and not be interrupted. However, Sarasa, at that moment, took a glass of wine and came closer to her, saying that she was pathetic and it irritated her incredibly. She poured this wine straight onto her sister. Of course she couldn't do anything about it. Sarah immediately felt very painful. This wine looked like blood. These red spots on her body immediately began to remind her of these events that happened. She had a panic attack. She fell to the ground and was breathing heavily. Meanwhile, the sister smiled maliciously and said that she felt as sorry as always. Only when she saw her, memories of Stein's nightmare immediately came to her mind. Then her sister knelt down before her and said that the girl claimed to be a saint despite the weakness she had shown. The girl told her not to hope for anything at all. Happiness was definitely not for people like Sarah, and she knew it for sure. Of course, the girl was very angry and upset, but only in a quiet voice did she tell her sister that she understood everything, and this thought sank deep into her head. However, at that moment, the Creator came into their room again. He asked for forgiveness for interfering, but said that Lady Miles had to go because the owner wanted to see her. He also said that the man was already waiting for her in his office, so Era simply got up from her seat and went to her father in a red dress. Before entering, she bowed and asked him for forgiveness, but the man simply stood and looked out the window. He didn't even turn around. The girl immediately suspected something was wrong. She quickly approached him and asked if everything was okay, but the man's hand began to shake violently from anger. Then the man said through clenched teeth that the imperial family had requested the cancellation of their engagement, and as soon as Era heard this, she immediately understood that this was very bad news. When the girl asked how this was possible, the man turned to her and said that it was simply unbelievable and asked how much more shame she was going to bring to their entire family. He was so angry at Sarah that he didn't even hesitate to hit her on the cheek and shouted loudly, saying that she was useless and a girl, and that he generally regretted leaving her alive. Sarah was used to this kind of treatment, so she just stood there with her head down and waited for it all to finally end. However, the father finally calmed down in the meantime. He said that the butler should lock her in his room and not let her out until a certain order. The man immediately understood everything. He took Sarah there and closed the room. The girl, meanwhile, still in a dirty dress, sat on her bed and simply thought about her life. She thought that if she married into the imperial family, then perhaps she could at least somehow help her kingdom of Steins and buy their guilt. However, now with the latest news she had heard, even that was no longer possible, and it was her last hope. She looked at the small stone that lay in her hand and thought that in that case she should have at least done this. In fact, this stone was called the Saint's Jewel. It was a jewel that the imperial family gave her when she became a saint 6 years ago. It was then that she realized that she could use this to channel the power of the saint, and from that time on, prayer became a part of her daily life, the only thing that could help her in difficult times. Of course, her sister did not understand at all what the girl was talking about. She did not know what it was like to direct the power of the saint into this stone and how this was even possible. In reality, this was all because even her sister, with incredibly powerful strength, knew nothing about it, and therefore thought that the girl was just talking nonsense. At that moment, Sarah really wondered if she could do it. And even if she could, she didn't understand why she was the only one who could do it, why they chose her. In fact, she still didn't know what this stone could do, what it was capable of, and what it was needed for. But she believed that perhaps over the 6 years of these prayers, she had been able to accumulate at least a little divine power. She sat and just looked at this jewel, and at that moment, she realized that she didn't even know when she could leave this room. Her father was incredibly gold, which meant that she could turn into a sitting here for a long time. She believed that if she had even the slightest chance to fix the whole situation that happened to her kingdom, then she had to take advantage of it. And so, several days passed from that moment, and the father finally came to the girl and said that he had good news for her. He said that a letter had arrived informing him that her engagement had been confirmed. Her fiancé was now King Harvard Terslot of Einstein's kingdom, and there was no more discussion about it. The girl, hearing this, immediately asked if this was really some kind of mistake. How could she get married in the kingdom of the Steins? She really thought that something was wrong there. The man told us that all this was really interesting. The offer came from them, so they probably just saw, wanted how she was suffering, and for this reason did it, and perhaps in order to cause her even more pain as a sign of the month. The man also said that it was as if they were just waiting for her to lose the blessing of the imperial family, and then decided to make their proposal in order to make sure they would agree to it. But it didn't really matter. The man said that when she got married, the Calculus family would not interfere in anything, even if something unfortunate and terrible happened. He said that in that place she was on her own. For that reason, she had to fight on her own. She was shocked to hear this, but she understood that the reason why the Stein kingdom offered her Prague was because of what happened when there was a storm. And she was aware of the fact that if marrying a man from the kingdom of Stein could somehow atone for what she had done, then she was willing to do it even if she had to pay the price of her life. For this reason, the girl stood up and, smiling, told father that this was very good. She was ready to marry a man from the kingdom of Steins, and for her, it would even be a great honor. The girl really looked very confident. She was comforted by the thought that she could at least somehow help them, and for this reason, she no longer saw anything bad in this news. Father, seeing her reaction, immediately laughed and said that it was the smartest choice she had ever made in her entire life, and he liked it. After that, he congratulated her on her engagement and walked out the door, leaving the girl alone again. At this very time, in the kingdom of the Steins, a young man was in the castle of Terslot and stood by the window waiting for the answer he so wanted to hear. And then the door to his room opened. His assistant came in. He turned to King Harvard and said that the preparations for the trip were completed. For this reason, he could already leave. The guy immediately thanked him and said that in that case, he was not going to delay. He threw his cloak over his shoulders and immediately went out. Meanwhile, Sarah was already preparing for this meeting. She was given a rather modest but beautiful dress that emphasized her figure, and her hair was also braided. She sat in front of the mirror and thought about the fact that not all of her memories of this place were good. But now that she was leaving, she felt a little sentimental. Even though she was even glad to leave this place, she was still sad to leave her homeland, because there were still those people here whom she appreciated. One of these was the maid Julia. The girl thanked her for her help in preparing and serving much, smiling and said that the lady looked simply delightful. Sarah was about to say something else when suddenly her father burst into the room, and she saw an angry expression on his face, as well as her sister behind him. Of course, this surprised her very much, but the man extended his hand forward and said that it was time for her to leave, so that she would not be late and would not make the man wait. He came closer to his daughter and said that the day had finally come when she was going to the kingdom of the Steins, and at that time the maid came out because she was asked to do so. Sarah curtsied and smiled and said that she was grateful to him for everything, and that she was also ready to fulfill her duty to bring at least a little honor to their family after everything that had happened. At that moment, to her great surprise, her sister came up to the girl and took her hands. This was the first time in many years that she had touched her. For a while they looked into each other's eyes, and her older sister even smiled a little. Of course, this amazed Sarah even more. She couldn't believe that this was really happening. The girl thought about the fact that she had not even imagined that her sister could come to accompany her. She thought that she would immediately run to celebrate and would not show up. And then suddenly, she thought about the fact that perhaps, in the end, she really was a part of this family, since even a girl like her made an exception. However, at that moment, the sister moved closer to her and whispered some kind of spell. The girl immediately felt very strange. Some kind of purple light appeared around her. Sarah didn't understand what was happening, but some kind of sign appeared on her hand, and the girl continued to hold her palm and whisper something. Then she fell to the ground and realized that she couldn't even move. She didn't understand what was happening and how this was possible. Sarah turned to her sister with a trembling voice and asked what she was doing, and most importantly, why. The girl leaned closer to her and whispered that they had decided to seal the path of her holy power. This was the decision of the House of Calkers, and for this reason she had done so. Her father stood aside at that moment and smiled. He also said that when they realized how useless the girl was, he was interested in how Stein was going to treat her. The girl could not believe that this was all really true. She already believed that her family had changed their attitude, but she was deeply mistaken. They simply went and set her up. However, her father, kneeling down, told her not to worry, because if the kingdom of Stein dared to take her life, then he would definitely avenge her. Hearing all this, the girl felt incredibly sad, and a tear flowed down her face. But she closed her eyes and thought about the fact that she had to do everything in her power, even without abilities. She lost consciousness, and when she opened her eyes the next time, she noticed that she was already in the cart. For some time, the girl simply lay there and tried to understand what was happening. Then Sarah sat down and immediately looked around, trying to understand where she was, because they continued on their way and it was quite difficult to determine the area. Looking out the window, she saw a forest road that was large enough for a carriage to pass through, so she assumed it was Stacy's forest, which was close to the border. She realized that she had been unconscious the entire way, and that was the reason time had passed so quickly. But after that, the girl noticed the seat next to her, on which there was a box. Of course, she was very interested in this. She came closer and, opening it, finally saw what she wanted. There, at the very top of things, lay her magic stone. Sarah took it in her hands and breathed a sigh of relief. She was incredibly grateful to fate that this stone had ended up there, because without it, she didn't know what she could have done at all. From the moment she regained consciousness, some more time passed, and the girl kept thinking about her father and sister, who had treated her so terribly. She couldn't believe that they would actually just go and betray her again. Sarah still hoped that they could treat her like a family member, even though they were sending her to another place. However, she was deeply mistaken, and it was very pathetic of her to assume that they could have treated her differently in any way. They had never even loved her, and had always treated her badly. Also, Sarah absolutely accurately assumed that the king proposed to her only out of anger, and he simply wanted revenge. She always knew this, and for this reason, she was not even sad, since this is exactly what she should have expected. Then she opened her stone, and looking at it, she thought that at least perhaps this jewel of the saint could help the kingdom of Stein. She really hoped for it. However, at that moment, the carriage suddenly stopped abruptly, and this frightened the girl very much. She did not understand what was happening. Quite strange and unknown people in black robes and hoods, holding weapons in their hands, seeing that the carriage had finally stopped, decided to act. They had been waiting for this moment specifically. However, as soon as they entered the carriage, they suddenly saw an open door on the other side and realized that Sayira had somehow simply escaped. Of course, they didn't like it at all. They saw the bottom of her dress nearby and immediately said that they had to run after her immediately. They really had to catch her. The girl, meanwhile, lay with all her might. She did not understand who these people were, but she realized the fact that they were very dangerous for her. She should not stop under any circumstances. The man, meanwhile, continued to run after her and said that she should not have been allowed to escape under any circumstances. She had to be caught. And then suddenly, when I looked to the side with Calamus, I saw a small purple smoke. She didn't want it to be me and her, but soon she heard a terrible roar. The girl realized that these were the same shadow monsters, and this scared her very much. But she was able to run past one of the wolves. He did not even pay any attention to her. This monster immediately began to walk towards the men who were chasing the Sirah. Guy did not understand why the shadow demons ended up in this place at all, and how they could escape at all. At that moment, the girl suddenly turned around and looked back and thought that she needed to immediately clear this area, and she immediately used her magical abilities. A bright light poured onto this monster, but at that moment, she felt an incredibly strong pain in her hand, right in the place where her sister had placed the seal. The shadow monster felt the evil energy at that moment and immediately paid attention to the girl, despite the fact that before that he had not noticed her at all. This monster immediately went towards her, but Sarah was not even against it. She had one plan how she could save these people, so she called this monster after her and told him not to lag behind. After that, she began to run away from him with all her might, because he was quite bloodthirsty and fast, and soon it was already difficult for her to run anywhere. She stopped and grabbed her hand, which hurt incredibly badly. Meanwhile, the monster was about to attack her. He even opened his huge mouth, but everything worked out. No one attacked Sarah, because a man in a knight's uniform appeared nearby. He managed to take out his huge and sharp sword in time and chopped off the monster's head. The girl immediately opened her eyes and was shocked when she saw this picture. She could not believe that this man could actually kill this shadow monster with just one blow. She had never seen such power before. Immediately after the monster was defeated, the guy approached the girl and addressed her in a rather low voice. The man asked Sarah if it was true that she was a saint from the house of Kalkur. The girl was amazed that this man knew who she was, so she decided that there was no way to even deceive him. But looking at his uniform more closely, she noticed a coat of arms on his cloak, which meant that this guy was a knight from the kingdom of Stein. She was incredibly surprised by this and scared because she assumed that they had sent someone to her to kill her as soon as she arrived. Of course, the girl was aware of the fact that even if she died now, she believed that she fully deserved it, but she had not yet done anything that she had planned, so she needed to try to survive at any cost. Therefore, Sarah, having fallen to the ground in pain, bowed her head before this man, and said that for carrying her country, Perhaps she really should have died right here and immediately. She was shaking all over with fear, but she still said that even if that was the case, she would still like him to give her a little more time and not kill her so quickly. She was clutching in her hands the very stone that she had managed to take from the carriage and was saying that she certainly could not die now. Then she screamed loudly and said that she definitely didn't want to die when she couldn't atone for anything yet. And that's why tears even flowed down her cheeks. She was really very sad. The man, having heard all this and seen the girl's reaction, just stood there for a while and watched all this in surprise. After that, he got down on one knee in order to be on her level and asked the girl to raise her head. His voice became much softer and more welcoming. When their eyes met, he said in a confident voice that he could swear on his life that no one was going to harm her. As soon as Saira heard this, it was of course difficult for her to believe all of this. However, little by little she began to calm down, because for some reason this man inspired confidence in her. Then he took the girl by the hands and said that she too had been so reckless then as she was now, and he was pleased to know that she had hardly changed. Hearing these words, Saira was shocked. She did not understand what this man even meant when he said this. But at that moment, he took his handkerchief and suddenly began to bandage her hand. And at that moment, Saira suddenly remembered that it all happened just like in childhood, when a little boy in uniform bandaged her hand and allowed her to go to battle. The man himself, smiling, said that this was the best thing he could do at the moment. He had said these words to her in childhood, and that was why the girl did not understand at all how this was possible. Saira was about to ask if it was really him, but she thought that it would be too impolite, so she simply stood up and thanked him for saving her. Smiling, she said that he managed to save her again, and as soon as the guy heard this, his cheeks turned a little red, because he also recognized this lady perfectly. Saira continued to hold onto her hand and said that she unfortunately couldn't keep the promise she made to him as a child and protect his people, and because of that, she felt incredibly sorry. At that moment, she bowed before him again and said that she really asked for forgiveness for her actions. However, the man, coming closer to her, said that if anyone should apologize in this situation, it was him, because he was the current king of Stein. His name was Harold Terslot, and he said that was his name because he knew that they had never introduced themselves back then, when they were children. And as soon as Saira heard his name, as well as his title, she could not believe that he really was the very king whom she was supposed to marry, according to her father's agreement. Harold then continued speaking and said that on the day that Stein's nightmare happened, he actually asked the saint to protect this nation. However, now that he had grown up, he realized that begging her for help was very stupid. Even though it was his kingdom, he dumped everything on her fragile shoulders. But she, too, was just a child then. Therefore, he also bowed before the girl and said that he offered her his sincere apologies, because he understood perfectly well, after all these years, that he should not have acted that way. Saira, hearing this, immediately began to object. She said that he shouldn't have apologized. She really considered it her fault, and therefore couldn't stand him saying something like that. Purifying the shadow disaster was her duty as a saint, but she failed to do so and therefore had to be punished. But Harold decided that it was better not to argue any further, and smiling, said that he would like to accompany her to the kingdom, so that nothing bad would happen again. He turned somewhere to the side and told her to quickly follow him for some part of the road. They walked in complete silence, and it was rather awkward. But when they continued walking further, Saira suddenly thought again about that day, when many people suffered precisely because of her fault. At one point, the girl found it incredibly difficult to breathe. She couldn't even hold her precious stone in her hands. It simply fell to the ground. She was just out of breath, and of course, Harold noticed this. He stopped and asked the saint what was wrong with her. As soon as Saira looked at him, she immediately saw the same boy she had met many years ago and thought that she could not have fallen now because of her health. However, she still could not stay on her feet and fell to the ground. She quickly began to ask the man for forgiveness and said that she had simply dropped one thing and therefore had to get it. At that moment, she touched her magic stone, and suddenly something strange happened. Some warm energy rushed around, and a white light appeared. Saira didn't understand what happened. She suddenly looked around and noticed that the entire space around was cleared of shadow fog. This amazed her beyond measure, but the man suddenly came closer to her and touched the flower that had grown next to her and said that this was exactly what he had expected from the saint. Sira immediately began to protest. She said that it was not because of her that this happened. She did not understand how this could happen, because her powers were sealed. She definitely could not clear this entire space. But Harold looked at the girl in surprise. He suddenly took off his jacket and threw it over her shoulders, telling her not to freeze. He actually noticed that she was starting to get a little shaky and guessed that she was cold. The girl accepted the cape and even blushed a little. But at that moment, the guy extended his hand to her with a soft smile and said that in that case they should move on since everything was okay with her. Sarah placed her hand in his and thanked him for it, and soon they finally reached the place where the rest of Harold's knights stood. As soon as one of his assistants saw His Highness, he immediately asked if everything was okay with him. The guy replied that it was, and also asked for forgiveness for the fact that they had to wait. Then he turned to the saint and said that she could trust absolutely every person in this place and not be afraid. Harold looked at her with an incredibly tender gaze and asked her to be sure of the honesty of his words and to be able to trust him, at least a little. Saira was silent for a while, and then said in a quiet voice that she had not been able to ensure the safety of his country. The man replied that there was no longer any need for it. He was going to take full responsibility for it, and so he didn't want to hear any more apologies from her. The girl again wanted to object to something. However, when she looked around, she saw faces that were smiling and agreeing with the words of His Highness. Then Ira thought that she really shouldn't have worried. She bowed before these people and thanked them again for this. Then Harold went forward and said that they needed to get the horses ready, and also asked that the saint rest a little in the meantime, as this could take some time. One of his assistants immediately approached His Highness and said that they were able to catch the very robbers who attacked, and the guy asked if it was true that they did not kill them. The man replied that it was so. Before leaving, the man also asked him to make sure that they were moved in such a way that the saint would not notice it at all. The man immediately said that he understood everything. Meanwhile, Sira approached one of the horses. She wanted to communicate with it at least a little, since she was afraid to ride it for some time, and therefore decided to just get to know it in advance. Harold came closer to her at that moment and asked for forgiveness for not being able to prepare a special carriage for her. The girl immediately became a little worried. She said that everything was fine. He definitely didn't need to worry about it. For her, it was no problem. Then the guy asked her if she had ever ridden a horse before, because they had to go to the capital, and the journey there was not short. The girl replied that she had traveled only a little, and that it was many years ago. The guy said that he was of course glad to hear it, but he still had to be next to her. For this reason, Harold picked her up and put her on the horse, and after that, he himself climbed on top of her. Smiling, he said that he would be there to support her if anything happened, so he asked her to at least try to relax and just not worry. Of course, it was very difficult for Sarah to do this, but soon she really got used to the fact that the man was behind her, and soon they arrived in the capital. As soon as the girl looked at this city, she immediately thought that this was the very same kingdom of Stein that she could not protect. She had not been in the area for quite some time, and for that reason, it was strange for her to return there after what she had done. Some time passed from that moment, and they entered the castle grounds. The girl looked around and noticed that the black aura was still flowing through the area. Of course, this made her very wary and made her worry a little. And we thought about the fact that the scars of Stein's nightmare still remained around and did not allow people to forget that terrible night. When they went further and further and entered the estate, the girl did not say a single word. As soon as they walked a little forward, she looked to the side and saw that someone came out to meet them. This man turned out to be Harold's younger brother. His name was Lucas. The guy was surrounded by knights and stood smiling, looking at his older brother. Harold, meanwhile, pushed the girl back a little with his hand, as if he was trying to protect her, and Lucas smiled and said that he heard that his brother had escaped from the castle. So he said that he never imagined that he would end up coming to congratulate them in person. When the man looked to the side and saw the saint, he immediately bowed and said that he was grateful that she had come to them, and also said his name and asked that she be sure to remember it. And finishing his sentence, he called her a fake saint, which of course made Sira very upset again. She couldn't believe that she would have to go through this whole nightmare again. But she found the strength in herself and, making a curtsy, greeted the man. She said that she came from the Lavrian Empire and gave her name. Ira also said that it was a great honor for her to meet them, and she would like to once again offer her deepest and most sincere apologies to the entire castle. Lucas, upon hearing this apology, immediately laughed loudly and said that there was no need for it at all. Waving his hand, he said that besides, the castle was currently preparing for a proper reception for such important guests from the Empire, so now was definitely not the time to formally greet the girl. Of course, Harold didn't like all this at all. He immediately yelled at his younger brother and asked him to at least watch his language a little. But Ira turned to him and said that everything was fine. He shouldn't have argued with his brother at all. Lucas, hearing this, immediately became indignant and said in a rough voice that his brother and he had lost their father, the head of the kingdom, that day. He slowly began to approach them and said that the scars were deep and many of their people were still suffering from that terrible night. After that, he looked Ira straight in the eye and said in a rough voice that, up until that moment, the Empire had not provided them with a drop of help, and for that reason, of course, they did not like it. He also said that there was no help directly from the saint, and for this reason, if she really considered herself a saint, then for what reason could she not save them? The girl didn't even know what to answer him, but Harold decided to stand up for her. He told his brother to stop. It was too much. Lucas looked at him in surprise, but he knew that his brother wouldn't joke, so he simply had to back off. He turned away from him and said that this country was still filled with chaos, so they had to be more careful when they went out anywhere. After the man finally left, Harold turned to the girl and asked if she was ready to go too. Sarah was glad to see a smile, but it made her feel a little better, and she said that she was ready. After she walked through the estate, she immediately thought about the fact that from the moment Stein's nightmare began, she was under constant surveillance, and all her movements were, of course, always limited. She barely even understood Stein's current state until that moment, when I got to this estate. All the information was always hidden from her, and she was not allowed to find out anything. Soon she suddenly stopped in the middle of the road and turned to His Highness. And after that, she asked if she could help them with anything at all. She looked at him with a very confident look, since this was precisely the reason she had come to Stein. She was even glad of this trip, since she believed that she could at least somehow atone for her guilt. Harold, hearing this about the saint, was a little surprised, but he came closer to her and said that tomorrow they were planning to distribute materials in the city center. And smiling, he asked if she would like to join them and help in this matter. The girl, hearing this, even became a little embarrassed. Every time she looked at this beautiful man, her heart began to beat a little stronger because he was so handsome. But she was also very happy that she could really help, so I put it in my hand in his. She said that she would be happy to do this. And so, when some time had passed since that moment, the next morning the girl went to the city center and was given special clothes so that no one would recognize her. When Sarah walked past all these people who were smiling, talking to each other, and truly living happily, it was something amazing for her. She was very glad that even despite its past, this town did not lose its joy and continued to exist. As she walked further and further, you wondered why His Highness had said some rather strange things before they had gone into town. A few hours before they arrived in town, Harold apologized to her for asking her to go to secret, since the engagement had not yet been announced publicly, and he was genuinely embarrassed that he was forcing her to hide her identity. But the girl was actually not even against it. She happily threw on the cape and said that she understood everything. It was necessary to prevent unnecessary disorder during their stay. The man was sincerely grateful to her. He thanked the girl and also said that he would send one of his men so that he would always be with her in case of anything and help. He sent him along with the girl Theodore. The man immediately bowed, introduced himself to Sayura, and said that he was the captain of the first nightly department. Harold then answered the girl that if I needed anything or if something happened, then she should not be shy and call Theodore. So he said that in order to hide his status, he would like her to forgive them for treating her as an equal. The girl, of course, did not object. The knight, hearing this, immediately smiled happily and said that in that case he was ready to help her. The Harlequin looked at him with contempt and said that he could have shown at least a little bit of subordination before they went into the city. The guy immediately asked for forgiveness, and Sira, hearing their mini quarrels, immediately laughed. In fact, it was very sweet for her. The guys immediately noticed this, and she asked for forgiveness, said that she shouldn't have acted so rudely, and was really embarrassed because she laughed. Harold looked at her in surprise for a while. Then he was silent and said that from that moment on, she would probably see and hear a lot of new things for herself. However, the affairs of the country were the responsibility of the royal family and, as expected, of course. So he asked the girl to try to make sure that all this did not burden her heart too much. As soon as Syra returned to the city, she immediately remembered these words of the man, and she did not understand at all why he decided to tell her about this before leaving. Theodore, who was walking next to her, suddenly turned to the girl and said that it was quite a lively city and asked if it seemed that way to her. He also smiled and said that thanks to the tireless efforts of His Highness, the city center was gradually regaining its energy and gradually returning to its usual routine. He wanted to say something else, but changed his mind, saying that she would understand it best when they reached their next destination. Sira noticed his expression. Theodore became incredibly serious and at the same time sad, which made the girl a little wary. And so, after some time, they finally entered a really dark area of the city where absolutely every corner of the earth was in this purple fog. And as soon as Sarah looked at these poor residents who were suffering from pain and this horror, she immediately felt incredibly sad. And at that moment, I immediately remembered the words of Lucas, who said that many residents were still suffering. She could not believe that it was really true, and the horror that she saw with her own eyes was the most terrible. At that moment, she immediately began to feel angry. She understood that it was her responsibility that all this happened, and for this reason, she would really like to correct this situation. At that moment, she saw Harold, who was already in the city. He turned to the residents and said that he had brought them supplies and asked them to take them if they really needed them. As soon as the girl saw him, she was a little surprised. She decided that she had to stick with him. As much as she didn't want to at that moment, she was already doing everything that she was told. So she also approached this cart and began to distribute to the poor people the supplies that the man had brought. People were, of course, incredibly happy because life was really very difficult for them, and Sarah simply forgot about all the accusations against her for a while. She did mechanical work and was happy that she could help them, at least a little. Then she suddenly looked into the carriage and saw that it was the last package with A, and after that, she heard the conversation of two men who were nearby. One of them said that he would never be able to repay His Highness for such incredible generosity and kindness. Another agreed with him and said that even when they could not work properly, he never left them. He was truly their greatest savior, and for this, they were grateful to him their whole lives. Others also agreed with their statements. They said that Harold was a truly wonderful person, and it was hard for them to even think that he lost the former king when he was still very young. But after that, one of the men said in a very rude voice that absolutely everyone in this country suffered because of that lying saint who couldn't even help them properly. They continued to throw accusations at Sarah, and the girl who was standing next to her immediately felt very bad. She pulled her hood up higher so that no one would really recognize her. At that moment, she felt a lot of discomfort. She was incredibly scared, but she really wanted to use her power again to help all these people and not let them down anymore. Then she thought about how, with the help of this stone, she was able to cleanse this land in the forest. She decided that she would definitely have to try it again if something happened, because she hoped that it could help her. Then suddenly, when the sari moved away from the cart, she saw a young girl who was lying on the floor. It was even difficult for her to move. She turned to Theodore and asked his forgiveness for leaving him. She explained that she needed to step away for a while. However, due to the fact that the man was near the children, he could not move away from her. He shouted loudly, asking where she was going. However, of course, the girl did not answer him. After some time, she ran across the street and approached the young girl, who, with difficulty, was still able to stand on her feet. Sarah immediately asked if she was injured anywhere. The girl was a little surprised to hear about this, and with a smile on her face, she said that it was just a little hard for her to move. After that, she lifted her skirt up a little and said that it was all because of what happened to her legs. And Sarah, looking more closely, immediately realized that there was a black aura around this lady. All her legs were filled with these wounds from the fog and those terrible beasts that attacked people. Of course, she would immediately want to help her use her power. But now, because she was sealed, she couldn't do it. Then, Sarah suddenly looked at her stone and thought about the fact that the purification in the forest occurred only at the moment when she touched the saint's jewel. She thought about the fact that perhaps it could clean it up, and the girl decided that, in that case, she could try to do it again. She sat down on the ground and immediately began to whisper quietly words. She really hoped that she would be able to save this girl. She turned to me and asked to be allowed to use the power of the saint again, and at that moment something lit up in her hands. As soon as the city resident saw this, she immediately became frightened. She asked what this girl was doing, but then she looked at her legs and immediately felt how the pain went away. After Sierra finished her ritual, she looked at the girl's legs and began to smile happily. She was incredibly happy that she had managed to do it after all. The girl then looked at the stranger in surprise and asked if it really was just the power of the saint. Then Sarah became worried. She understood that she could not allow anyone to find out who she was right at that moment. It could only cause trouble for His Highness. So she immediately stood up and with trembling hands pulled her cape even tighter. She tried to think of something to say in her defense, but she couldn't do it. But the resident suddenly seemed to understand that the girl was very afraid, and immediately smiling, she said that she would not tell anyone anything. Sarah was very surprised to hear this and immediately looked at her. Then the resident came closer to her and said that during the nightmare in the Stein, the girl was able to save her brother's life, and now she saved her too. The young lady's eyes began to well up with tears. She was truly incredibly grateful to the girl for this help, and she thanked the saint for it. Sarah, hearing all this, even blushed a little. She was incredibly pleased to hear that she was able to save at least someone. She was also happy to realize the fact that there were still people who could be grateful to her and whom she could really help at least a little. Meanwhile, the girl heard Theodore's voice, who was already running after her and shouting her name all the time in order to understand where she had gone. The saint, when she turned to the side and saw that he was really looking for her, she immediately bowed to the girl and said that she already needed to go. The resident immediately bowed to her in response and thanked her again. She also said that if they ever met again, she would like them to introduce themselves properly. Syra smiled and said that she wouldn't mind, and also thanked her again. After that, she went to meet Theodore so that he wouldn't worry too much. And when the girl thought about everything that had happened, she looked at her stone and realized that when she touched the saint's jewel, her power, which was sealed, was somehow able to break through. Despite the fact that the power was sealed, she was still able to use it several times already, and this gave her hope. The girl understood that she had to tell His Highness about the power of the saint and that jewel, so she was very serious. When several hours had passed since then, it was already dark outside the window. They returned to the castle, and the girl and Harold were in the living room. They were drinking tea, and the man smiled and turned to her, saying that she had said that she wanted to talk to him about something and asked if it was true. She immediately said that it was really so. Then she pointed to her hand and asked if he could look at it. The man, seeing this, was a little surprised, and then asked if she would like to tell him something in more detail, since he had absolutely no idea what they were talking about. The saint immediately smiled and said that of course her power was sealed by the Calcure family, and for this reason she could not use it. She pointed to the mark on her hand and said that it was proof of that. But Harold, hearing this, was surprised, and immediately said that somehow she was able to clear the territory in the forest, and asked how this was possible. Sarah then took her stone in her hands and replied that it was all thanks to the saint's jewel that she was able to do this. The man, hearing about this, was very surprised, because he had never heard such a thing mentioned before. But Sarah explained that several years ago, after Stein's nightmare, she was able to pour power into this stone little by little, and did this constantly in the hope that it could bring at least some result. She looked at her stone and said that with it, even though her powers were sealed, She was able to use her saint power and cleanse that forest, as well as the girl who needed help. She looked at the man and said that, of course, she didn't know why she was born with this particular power, but she really wanted him to allow her and give her a chance to use this thing and power to atone for her guilt. She looked him straight in the eyes and said that, of course, she really wanted to help, at least a little, save these poor suffering people, relieve them of pain, because they deserved it more than anyone else.